For my project, which I've titled Roots in the Revolution, Revolution in the Southern Backcountry and My Ancestors. And so what I wanted to do was to be able to tell the story of the revolution in the South, particularly in the Carolina Backcountry, and then weave in the stories of my ancestors based on documents that I could find. And so, overview. So, the topic of this project that I wanted to do was to summarize the role that the Carolina Backcountry and the Southern Campaign played in the American Revolution. And as I went through in a relative chronological fashion, weave in my personal family into that story. And so a lot of the records that I use are Revolutionary War pension records, old texts, um, just resources that I could find. Some of them I could find more than others, and so I'll talk about that as I go through. And so this, one of the reasons this became area interest, so article by Don Higginbotham was talking about, and one of my other classes we talked about Jack Green's Pursuits of Happiness as well. But I think this quote from that book, so until relatively recently, so serious historians have devoted far more attention to the northern colonies, specifically New England and to the South. And so that was one of the aspects that inspired me to look at particularly the Carolina backcountry and the South and its role in the Revolution, but then to be able to connect my personal family history to that area of study. All right, so as we go through, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about the battles that are going on in a relatively chronological fashion, but then tie in my ancestors that served some role in those stages of battle. And so, Battle of Sullivan's Island off the coast of South Carolina, so June 28, 1776. So, Sir Henry Clinton led a combined force against the island, which is just north of Charleston. And so the defenses included an unfinished fort constructed of palmetto logs. And eventually down the road, that's where the South Carolina flag would get the palmetto tree from this great battle, which we see was a great victory for the Patriots as the British Navy and troops uh, were defeated. And so, because of the palmetto logs and their role they played, it became a symbol of South Carolina. And so, one of my ancestors, so William Brashears, which you see spelled many different ways, and on this record they listed him as Bratchers. So he was a private in the company commanded by John Blassingame, and this was a regiment under Thomas Sumter, who is known as the Gamecock, at least here in South Carolina. And we see from his records that he received a wound with bayonet from the enemy in the right hand, which in a great measure disabled it. And then he served as a lieutenant against the British in the years 79 and 80 under Captain Gowan, Colonel White, and then General Pickens. And so we see a little bit of the picture, and so there was two parts to this battle, and so there was the naval attack, and then there was also an army attack which tried to cross an inlet, and this is where he was probably wounded with this bayonet. During the same time, 1776, there's also a war on the frontier with the Cherokee. So, in conjunction with this attack on Sullivan's Island, the British were instigating the Cherokee to attack the backcountry settlers. Several massacres occurred on these frontier farms. And so, without the conflict on the coast after the British were defeated, these states, so North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, were all able to concentrate this militia power to be able to get rid of this threat of the Cherokees. And so one of my ancestors was Captain Thomas Howard. So he was my sixth great grandfather. And he was in the South Carolina Rangers, which marched up, which was then known as Warrior Mountain, became Round Mountain, with the help of his friendly Cherokee acquaintance named Skyuka. Skyuka carried them through a little known gap to outflank the Cherokee. They came up from the rear, the Indians were defeated, and this was part of a larger operation against the Cherokee in South Carolina. Most of that was focused in the western part of the state. And this gap that they used near Tryon, North Carolina, is still known as Howard's Gap today. Has a road, Howard's Gap Road, which goes from Greenville up to Hendersonville, North Carolina. So Captain Thomas Howard, so he served in the South Carolina militia under Colonel Benjamin Roebuck as a lieutenant and a captain, and he was instrumental in this victory at the Battle of Round Mountain. It's been hard to be able to find some more records on him than what I've found. And so here's his gravestone, which is located about 5 miles from my house. And then here is the monument in downtown Columbus, which commemorates the Battle of Round Mountain, which was near that, right across the North Carolina, into the North Carolina border. And we see Captain Thomas Howard and Skiuka commemorated in the monument and the plaque. After this, the Cherokees settled down, and there became what many consider a civil war in the backcountry in South Carolina between 77 and 79. So it's just the Patriots or partisans and the Tories, limited skirmishing. And so Landrum in his 1897 book called this the interval of quiet in the backcountry. And so there's no large battles or engagements, but just skirmishing. And so these smaller engagements would set the stage in a lot of ways for the larger battles that would come later. So one of my ancestors, John Bearden, so he was a private in Captain Wofford and Lieutenant Graham's company of Rangers. And so we see that he was enlisted, re-enlisted, and discharged several times. And so as a Ranger, so what he writes as in his pension record, he was out on scouting expeditions against the Cherokee and Loyalists. Then we see spying and scouting expeditions, and then he rejoins back in the 1780s and is involved in the siege of 96, which is toward a little bit lower in the state than where I live, a little bit closer to Columbia. And so he's involved in that, which that is May 22nd, June 19th of 1781. And so I've tried to keep them as chronological as possible, but when I'm talking about people, I might have to jump ahead just a little bit. And here is his stone, which actually is in Tennessee, where he moved, got a grant of land, and moved to sort of mid-Tennessee, and then he died there in 1836. We skip ahead in time a little bit, and so we move to the Siege of Charlestown in 1779. And so as the British are making their way to Charlestown from Savannah, which they had taken earlier, they meet resistance at Stono Ferry, which is south of the city, and this becomes the Battle of Stono Ferry. And so the Patriots broke through, looked like it potentially could be a victory. It looked like the British started to reinforce, and so the Patriots retreat in an organized manner. And so this leads to the Siege of Charlestown from April 1st to May 12th, 1780, and ends with the surrender of the town in May 12th of 1780. And so one of my ancestors, Reuben Fletcher, so he was a private in the North Carolina militia under Moore and Little. He was engaged at the Battle of Stono Ferry, June 20th, 1779, discharged soon after, but then, as you'll see with a couple of my ancestors, they re-enlist as substitutes, and in this case, he enlisted as a substitute for Charles Breedlove under Douglas and Lee. British move from their base, now they've taken Charlestown, and so they're going to move in the backcountry with this new aim of taking the South, using the support of the Tories that were thought to be numerous in the South, and gain control of the South and slowly move their way north. So early battles in this quiet period, which we talked about in a previous slide, had led the way to be able to maintain support, partisan support, in this civil war that was going on in the backcountry. And so, as Walter Edgar states, so each of these engagements played a role in leading up to this one of the decisive battles of the war at Kings Mountain. And so, many, including Edgar, state that the backcountry of the Carolinas was the stage in which the war was actually won. And so Joshua Jones, one of my ancestors from North Carolina, he was in the North Carolina militia under Wood and Malmedy, and he was one of the Overmountain men from Wilkes County, North Carolina, and was engaged at the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 7th, 1780, in which he was injured. And evidence suggests that he might have proceeded with his command to Guilford Courthouse and Eutaw Springs, but I don't have any conclusive evidence of that. Here is his gravestone, which is actually on the Biltmore estate, and so he owned the Hominy Valley, including the vineyard of present-day Biltmore House. And so to be able to go to his gravestone, we have to get special permission to enter the Biltmore estate. Guilford Courthouse, so after Cowpens, Greene takes Cornwallis on a race to the Dan, crosses, rests, come back, and they end up with the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And so even though it was a great victory for Cornwallis, he suffered great losses. One of my ancestors from Virginia, John Washington Wingo, was enlisted, went on several tours, ended up he's by far the most, so 4 tours, in which he was, during the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, he was out foraging in the time of the battle, but pursued the British Army as far as Ramsey Mill on Deep River. And so he was getting supplies while the actual battle happened, but then pursued the British after they left. And so we see his tombstone, which is in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Cornwallis moves after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, his plan to go to Virginia, because he had had enough adventures in South Carolina and North Carolina. And so we end up with a couple of my ancestors, so Jesse Rickman and his debatable father, Dr. William Rickman. So Jesse Rickman was in North Carolina militia in the District of Wilmington. Have limited records, but this would have been the region and the time when Cornwallis was moving through, so I'd assume he would be engaged, but that's inconclusive. Jesse's father, Dr. William Rickman, which is based on long-standing tradition, the Rickman Family Association, and multiple sources, but this has been recently disputed by the historical group that manages Dr. Rickman's plantation in Virginia. And we see Jesse Rickman's tombstone, which is south of Asheville, North Carolina, and the monument on Dr. Rickman's property in Charles City County, Virginia. We move on to Yorktown, so Cornwallis withdraws from North Carolina. Washington moves down. This sets the stage for the siege of Yorktown, September and October 1781. One of my ancestors, Roland Johnson, enlisted in the 1780s. Was discharged, re-enlisted. On this second enlistment, he meets up with Washington troops. They move across the Chickahominy River in order to intercept the retreat of the British. And then he's transferred to another company, and then they march, and he's involved in the siege of Yorktown. And so conclusions. So the American Revolution touched many lives during this 8-year duration. By looking at and weaving in the stories of our ancestors, we can give a voice to those who haven't had the chance before, and allows us to add depth to the overall body of research in this area. And for me, I think that anytime you can add this personal connection, it makes things more meaningful. And so by adding this personal connection, it makes these events of the past more tangible and meaningful as we reflect back on them. And I think that's the part of history which really gets people excited when they can see how one of their ancestors or somehow they're personally connected to the events of the past. And so here's my sources. So I tried to use as many primary sources as I could. And then here are my secondary sources. So enjoy doing the project. Hope you enjoyed hearing about it and viewing it. And thanks for listening.